Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. You're watching the Ideas Factory with me, Nakma, and with me is Professor Harsh Pant. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will be, of course, looking at Prime Minister's three-nation tour. We will be looking and focusing at the G7 as well as the Quad meeting, Prime Minister's Australia visit. Along with that, the G20 meet that took place in Srinagar and its significance. It's of huge importance. There are a series of very important diplomatic global events that took place, all of which have a huge geostrategic significance. How is it going to affect us? What was India's role on all these platforms? And India's diplomatic stature at all these platforms has grown and seems to have grown. We will look at all of that and understand that. We shall begin with the G7. The Prime Minister at G7 raised concerns for the global South. We heard that, Hush. And there was a change in India's tone when he talks of no one should be unilaterally changing the status quo. How do we understand that, and how does it affect our equation with Russia and this very clear message that the Prime Minister gave? Was it a change from what India has been saying till now? India has always said that we must respect the UN, everyone should respect the UN Charter. So how do you look at this change of language now?
I think, Nagma, this has been, of course, quite busy week, busy few days for India and for the Prime Minister. But I think with the G7, the idea was to somehow, as India holds the presidency of G20, to also develop some synergy in the agenda between G20 and G7. And I think when you hear Prime Minister speak at the G7, you hear a lot of the concerns that perhaps the Prime Minister and India are raising, as part of their G20 presidency. So I think when you talk of, for example, the global South, or when you talk of some of these concerns on territorial integrity and sovereignty, it is also a reflection that a large part of the global South is concerned about these matters. That they are concerned that conflict is perpetuating. There is no end in sight to the conflict in Ukraine, and it is hogging all the limelight, which of course we also saw at the G7, where the presence of the Ukrainian president seems to take the sheen away from the G7 agenda itself. So I think what the Prime Minister, when you talk of the language, was doing was also articulating his concerns, India's concerns, and the concerns of a large part of the world, that we are moving in a direction where we don't know the end game. And I think his meeting with the Ukrainian president was also about reflecting the concerns of the wider international community, when he said that, look, this is a matter for the humanity itself. It's not simply a question of political or economic challenges that Ukraine is facing. Of course, it is. But what it has spawned beyond Ukraine is a wider crisis of a magnitude that we have not seen in recent times. And it is impacting international order, it is impacting multilateral institutions, it is impacting the way we govern ourselves at the international level. And perhaps that's why his emphasis on territorial integrity was stronger this time, perhaps, than we have seen in the past, because he was not only looking at it from the perspective of Ukraine, and of course from the perspective of India, but also from the perspective of a large part of the world, which seems to have been forgotten in this entire kerfuffle between the West and Russia over Ukraine.
Absolutely. He also spoke of the UN reforms, and he flagged that the institutions created in the last century are probably not in line with the system of the 21st century. And he mentioned that it will have to become the voice of the global South. If I may ask, what are the key takeaways for you from this G7?
I think the key takeaway is that G7 at the moment, despite being a platform for of the world's most advanced economies, is also perhaps looking for a new sense of purpose. Because that's what we saw with Japan inviting a range of actors, including India, which are not part of G7. So India was a special invitee. But I think the sense that we are at an inflection point in the global order, and G7 countries themselves may not be perhaps equipped to deal with those challenges on their own. So therefore, you need a broadening of base, you need a broadening of engagement. And I think the second point that comes out is that how intertwined we have become, or economic issues have become with the geopolitical issues. That when you have, a Ukrainian president making this appearance, and everything around it getting centered around his visit, that sends out a message that geopolitics is today overshadowing the geoeconomic concerns. Perhaps a lot of the concerns that the G7 flagged in the way of debt crisis or the wider food and agriculture crisis that the world is facing. But I think their ability to move forward on many of these matters is limited because there's a lack of a global consensus, and major powers like Russia and China are not part of the equation at the moment. And of course, the third element that comes out is that there is a strong resistance building up against Chinese, hegemonistic designs, whether they are economic or whether they are, political and diplomatic. And we heard this term of economic coercion being mentioned, and a lot of the framing, without mentioning China, was about economic coercion and how this ability of countries to dominate global supply chains or to dominate global trade matrix is detrimental to the wider global community. That sense came out, whether you hear individual comments like the one, for example, Rishi Sunak, UK's Prime Minister, made about China, or whether the consensus of the G7 statement that comes out. So I think a lot of these things will have great bearing on the way you will see interactions amongst countries. But certainly, you see the fault lines developing quite categorically, and you see those fault lines becoming sharper by the day, and G7 working or moving in a direction where certainly they want to engage China, so we have moved from decoupling to de-risking. But I think at the same time, they remain committed to take on China also, and particularly in the economic matters. And when we saw, for example, countries like Canada or Italy also expressing their discontent, I think that was quite interesting to see, because some of these countries have had very close ties with China and have been reluctant to break their economic ties with China. So I think we are looking at a world that is now divided, fractured, but also the ability of G7 as a platform to provide solutions was also in quite sharp relief here, because it was quite evident that the G7 in and of itself won't be able to offer many answers.
How about the Quad platform? The Quad meeting also took place on the sidelines. And here also we saw that there were concerns and veiled reference, of course, to the Chinese threat. Like you say, there is also an effort to engage China, but the nations are also wary of China's dominance on economic supply lines. There is strong resistance against China. So there was a reaffirmation that we saw for an open, a stable, secure, and prosperous Indo-Pacific at the Quad as well. So, when you talk of G7 and we look at Quad and the threat that China poses, how do you see Quad faring there?
I think Quad, we have seen Quad gaining momentum in the last few years. And certainly it was a disappointment that the summit that was supposed to happen in Australia could not happen because of Mr. Biden's preoccupations at home. But I think the fact that still the four leaders managed to meet on the sidelines of the G7 is a reminder that all four nations remain committed to Quad as a platform and remain committed to making it more robust. I think there's need now to put more work into making it more effective. Perhaps operationalizing a lot of the ideas that the Quad agenda had laid out in great detail, but certainly the commitment is there. And I think for China, therefore, it should be some cause of worry that some things that it assumed a few years back would never happen are beginning to happen, and are beginning to happen at regular intervals. And there is no sign of Quad either getting weakened or the resolve of the four nations getting weakened, despite, let us also remember, despite changing governments. We have seen change of government in Australia. We have seen US transition from Trump to Biden. We have seen Japan's government, Kishida, coming to office. And so we have seen that commitment only grow. And so what I think as a platform has now become the foremost platform in the Indo-Pacific. But the challenge now moving forward is, can Quad emerge as that credible alternative? Or can Quad countries pool their resources and emerge as a credible alternative to a large part of the Indo-Pacific, which are looking for alternatives? And I think in that context, India's outreach in the South Pacific this week was also very interesting.
India, of course, has had a very fruitful and very successful visit by the Prime Minister. His three-nation tour has been lauded, and he received a very grand welcome. We also hear that there's going to be a new consulate in Brisbane, and Australia is going to open a consulate general in Bangalore. Of course, the degrees being recognized by both the countries. That's a huge thing for the students. India-Australia relationship has been good. This visit, where does it take that relationship, and how do you see this visit's impact?
I think the fact that Indian Prime Minister was visiting Australia after 2014, and let's remember that before that, for 28 years, there had been no visit to Australia. So I think it is in some ways a remarkable trajectory that India-Australia relations have followed in the last decade, where we have seen a transformative moment in this relationship, emerging and underscoring the realities of this relationship. And this is a relationship that has great potential, and that potential is increasingly being recognized and tapped. This is also a relationship which is being driven both, by the top leaders at a top-down level, but also bottom-up level, as you mentioned, the diaspora enthusiastically welcoming Mr. Modi and playing, and I think Mr. Modi acknowledged that fact that, look, this relationship has prospered because of the diaspora in some ways. The diaspora is playing such an important role. They are in privileged positions in Australia today. They are recognized as one of the most important diasporas in the country. And I think that that changes the way a country looks at another country when you have that kind of a link. So it's a top-down, bottom-up, approach that Australia have followed. We are also looking at Indian Prime Minister engaging the economic actors, economic constituencies in Australia, inviting them to invest in India. And I think as Australia looks at moving beyond China, shifting its economic base away from China, India perhaps is the only country that offers, Australian businesses the kind of scale that they would need to make that shift. And I think, this old paradigm of Commonwealth curry and cricket has certainly given way to much more dynamism in the relationship, where we are looking at soft and hard power interacting together. So while you had the soft power of diaspora, or the soft power of Indian culture and food, you also see hard power engagement in the sense of whether it is Quad or whether it is South Pacific. And so you have the sense that India-Australia relationship is no longer simply a bilateral matter. It's global in scope, whether you look at it through the wider Indo-Pacific, where Australia and India are engaged in every single domain, or whether you look at it in the smaller context of the South Pacific, where Indian Prime Minister went there, but it's traditionally considered to be Australia's backyard. And now today you see an interesting convergence between Australia, India, the US, perhaps working together in that part of the world. So what we are looking at is a relationship that is flowering at various levels. And Prime Minister's visit underscoring that commitment from India's side that we will keep on, keep on taking that conversation forward. And I think what was also interesting, the fact that he mentioned, that attacks on temples and the fact that he did it publicly. And the fact that he said that, as friends, we can discuss our differences openly, without getting into a recrimination mode, and the Australian Prime Minister supporting Indian Prime Minister on that. So I think that also shows you the maturity in the relationship at this point, where we are not, finicky about expressing our differences in the open.
Absolutely. The Prime Minister very clearly mentioned the vandalism on the temples in Australia, and it was received well by the Australian Prime Minister. Now, the Prime Minister's visit to Japan and Australia kind of overshadowed his visit to Papua New Guinea. But of course, we saw the Papua New Guinea Prime Minister touching his Prime Minister Modi's feet, and that was the image of the day. It was a huge, huge visual spectacle, and that kind of overshadowed the other aspects of this visit. So how important, how significant was this visit to Papua New Guinea, looking at the country's closeness to China and its strategic significance? Prime Minister's visit there, how will it help in engaging Papua New Guinea and steering it away from China a bit?
See, if one were to look at this entire visit of Prime Minister abroad, I think despite the fact that it was the image overtook the substance, I would say the most substantive aspect came from South Pacific, from his visit to Papua New Guinea, because it was quite remarkable to hear leaders from the South Pacific saying and openly saying that, look, we want India to follow India's leadership in the global South. These are quite remarkable statements to come from a region that is traditionally seen as falling into Chinese, becoming part of Chinese sphere of influence. And of course, the traditional player there had been Australia. So in that context, the sense that you got from the region was that they do not want to be part of the geopolitical rivalry that is emerging between US and China. They want to concentrate on issues that matter to them, whether it is infrastructure and connectivity, whether it is sustainable development or climate change. So I think, in some ways, that was the most remarkable aspect of this visit, despite it being overshadowed by the other parts of Mr. Modi's visit, that India, could communicate very categorically to the nations in the Pacific and could reiterate its commitment. And there was a lot of receptivity to that commitment in the region, that countries in the region were willing to say that India is welcome. We want greater involvement by India, and we're willing to support India wherever possible. And I think that in some ways perhaps captures the essence of the argument that we were initially discussing, that there is a large part of the global South which is very perturbed about the way global geopolitics is evolving. And there, India's initiatives, perhaps as in the last few years, or perhaps as part of its G20 presidency, has helped in galvanizing some of these geographies in partnership with India. So I would say that perhaps has been the most remarkable aspect of his journey, where India could lay a claim to a part of the world where many would think India has very, very limited role to play. But when Indian Prime Minister goes there, he gets this kind of welcome, he gets this kind of response, he gets this kind of commitment. I think it underscores that India can also play a larger role in parts of the world where traditionally India has been absent. And in South Pacific, strategically, we may have been absent. But again, culturally, historically, we have been present. In, for example, in Fiji, more than 50% people are of Indian origin. So it's a remarkable, geography to not to take an interest in for India. So I think the fact that we are doing that augurs well for India's leadership. And the fact, I think, that the final point on this is the fact that it did not happen. But what was supposed to happen initially was that Mr. Biden was supposed to visit during Mr. Modi's visit. And that was an extraordinary moment that you have India and the US together coming to South Pacific and saying, of course, Secretary Blinken went there later, but both these countries together were willing to work in a strategic geography, which perhaps many would say, what is there for India in that distant geography? But I think Mr. Modi has made it very clear that India's equities are quite huge, and India's equities are growing in that part of the world, and India will remain committed with this forum for India Pacific Islands nations.
Of course, Prime Minister's visit there, this part of South Pacific, which was neglected, like you said, culturally and historically been there, but otherwise, this visit really reiterates that India is very much interested in that region. And of course, President Biden could not visit Papua New Guinea. He had to curtail his trip. he had to curtail his trip because of this huge crisis that is being America is facing. America, it's looming large, the U.S. debt ceiling crisis. And how do you think this is going to play out economically, of course, for the world, for India, and politically, also affecting Mr. Biden's foreign policies? It affects his political goals.
Yes, I think that's a real concern. I think it should be a concern for the US. It should be a concern for America's partners and allies across the world, because a large part of diplomacy is about showing up. And if you're not showing up at the right time, despite making promises, then that does not really, go down very well with a number of nations. And of course, we have seen Secretary Blinken going there and signing the defense pact. But I think, one of the problems that America is facing today is a crisis of credibility. That you have domestic problems in Washington. And the polarization in Washington is not allowing America to step up to the plate at a time when perhaps many countries would want America to step up to the plate, would want a larger American role. So I think when American president, despite committing himself, then had to renege on his commitment, then I think it does send a message that America's domestic problems are becoming too big. And they're coming in the way of a very coherent foreign policy strategic approach to the wider world. One hopes that this gets rectified soon and that it does not become a recurring phenomena. But I think the challenges domestically for any major power have a great impact on the way they approach foreign. They go for foreign policy projection and the way their credibility is perceived. So I think this is a question for America to really seriously ponder upon, and for America's partners and allies also to press upon upon the US that these kinds of things, these kinds of aspects, these kinds of developments in diplomacy should be avoided to an extent possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before we wrap up this episode of the Ideas Factory, a very significant event that took place here. India was the host of G20, and India just hosted a very successful tourism group meet in Srinagar, which was very, very significant symbolically too, considering this was the first global event after the abrogation of 370, and it took place very successfully. There was a huge concern about security threats and the neighbors creating problem. Of course, China, Pakistan, Turkey have formed a group and have raised their concerns, but the other members participating and India actually hosting it successfully. Symbolically, it's very, very important. And how do you see this successful summit?
I think it's a great a great moment, and I would say perhaps as important a moment as the abrogation itself. The challenge of Kashmir is today a challenge for India as to how quickly we can develop and provide for the aspirations of ordinary people in the state, in the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. I don't think it's a question for any external interlocutor anymore. And I think, Pakistan, of course, will do what it has to do in terms of raking it up. But I think for most other countries, and I would say including China, this has become a sideshow. This is no longer the central question that China sees in its engagement.
Mm-hmm.
With issues on the table, and by successfully concluding this meet, India has shown that it has moved beyond that initial problem that it had in terms of public relations. How do you communicate to the rest of the world, and how does the rest of the world accept what has changed in Kashmir? And I think the reception to this event shows that the rest of the world is comfortably behind India on this.
Of course, and that's very significant, the acceptance and the recognition by the rest of the world of what has changed in Kashmir and for the better. So, of course, it created huge opportunities for the development of tourism in many areas. So all that has been quite successful and remarkable. So that's it that we have time for on this episode of the Ideas Factory.